Halime just made it to her husband's side in time. Her husband was rushing to get home because he didn't want to stay in the city. Halime, however, wanted to breastfeed our Prophet as soon as possible. She gave him her left breast, but he wouldn't take it. She insisted, but he didn't want to feed on her left breast. She then gave him her right breast, and he started feeding straight away. This was the first piece of good news that showed our Prophet would bring fruitfulness and happiness. They didn't go to the pasture that night and stayed in Mecca until the morning. Both Halime and her husband slept very well. When it was morning, Halime's husband ran to milk the camels that were with them. Each breast of the animal was full of milk as if it was a fountain. Haris, full of surprise, didn't know what to do. How on earth did these camels get so much milk? He called to his wife in amazement. "Hey, Halime, you should know that you got a very blessed and beneficial child." Halime told him he was right. "I hope he will be that way too." What they thought was right. The most beautiful child on earth would bring themselves fruitfulness. At that time, something very odd happened again. Halime was well behind the group of travelers she had gone to the city with, because it had taken her such a long time to find a child to nurse. She could see from the cloud of dust ahead that the group was in front. Halime and her husband had to catch up with their friends, but the donkey they were riding on was very old and weak. But then something odd happened. When Halime got on the donkey, it suddenly started to move very quickly. That weak and old donkey had gone and a very strong and fast one had come in its place. Halime and her husband were very surprised. The donkey was the same donkey, but what made it go so fast all of a sudden? But they then realized the reason for this. It was because our Prophet was with them. The animal was coming to life and getting stronger for our Prophet. It continued its journey quickly. They reached the other travelers in a short time and even left them behind. Everyone in the group of travelers was amazed and couldn't believe their eyes. They shouted, "Halime, what's happening? Why don't you wait for us?" Halime replied, "I'm not the one making it go fast. It's doing by itself." The women were left amazed. Then they asked with curiosity, "Did you change your donkey?" Halime said, "No, you can see for yourselves that it's the same animal. There is something surprisingly different about it today." No one could work out the secret behind it. Our Prophet was now in the Beni Sa'd tribe's pasture. From now on, he would breathe the clean air and drink the clear water of the pasture. He would also hear the sound of birds chirping and lambs bleating. There was an unseen fruitfulness in Halime's house after our Prophet came to this house. Her breasts that had no milk were now full of it. The animals were feeding until they were full and gave all the milk that was needed. This fruitfulness was only seen in Halime's home where our Prophet was. It wasn't the same for the rest of the people in the pastures. Those women who didn't want to take our Prophet because he was an orphan were now crying. If only they had known our divine child would bring them such fruitfulness and blessings along with him. For that reason, the people in the pastures were all curious about it. Halime's sheep were fed every night and came back with their breasts full of milk. However, the other people's sheep were all hungry and yearning for milk. They couldn't make any sense out of this. first they blamed the shepherds and they got angry at them. They said, "Go and see how Halime's shepherd feeds his sheep. Milk drips from their breasts. Who knows where they graze? Go and feed our sheep where he feeds his." The shepherds were helpless. They were taking their sheep where Halime's sheep were grazing. While their sheep were craving in hunger, Halime's sheep returned with their tummies full and full of milk. Both the shepherds and the owners of the sheep could see the situation. However, no one could work out the reason for this. All they could do was look at each other in astonishment. But of course there was a reason for all of this. The fact that Halime's sheep were full and the other sheep were hungry was nothing to do with grass. Halime's answer to those who asked the reason for this was, "This is one of the mysteries of Allah. Everything started when we returned from Mecca. Allah had given everything to Halime. Why? The answer was very simple. Halime was hosting the dearest human being of Allah in her house. Days were passing by. Famine and drought hadn't left the pasture of the Beni Saad tribe. Every week the people of the pastures would come out all together and pray for the rain. Everyone would pray for rain according to their beliefs, but it was of no use. It was one of those days when they went outside to pray for the rain. They cried and they begged for the rain. But not even a drop had fallen from the sky. Then our Prophet came to the mind of an old lady. She said, "There is a Meccan boy in my neighbor Halime's house. Since the day he came, there has been fruitfulness in her house." She carried on saying, "That child brings much luck. Let's bring him here. Maybe he will bring us luck too, and our prayers will be accepted." The other people hesitated at first. They then thought, what bad would come of it? And they agreed with the old woman's offer. Halime had gone to the pastures where the people had gathered, and the old woman ran up to Halime. She told her idea and Halime accepted her offer. They quickly ran to the house. Halime took our Prophet in her arms and covered his face with a piece of cloth to protect him from the sun. They left the house and shortly afterwards they saw something very odd. A small cloud was overshadowing them. At first they didn't think it was important and carried on walking, but the cloud was following them. It was as if it wanted to protect them from the sunlight. Halime and the woman were left in amazement. There was no need for the piece of cloth anymore, because the cloud was keeping them in the shade. They reached the crowd of people with their cloud-like umbrella. Everyone opened their hands to pray once more, and they begged Allah. A religious man was holding our Prophet in his arms. Everyone was looking at him, and they all said, "Oh dear Allah, please let it rain for the love of this child." When the prayers were being said, our Prophet looked meaningfully into the sky. Everyone had fallen in love with his eyes. It wasn't possible not to fall in love with those big black holy eyes. The long months of waiting were to end. The cloud that was shadowing our Prophet suddenly got bigger and spread out over the horizon. In a short space of time, the small cloud left a huge cloud in its place. The sky was now covered in clouds. There were cries of happiness amongst the prayers. Everyone was shouting, "The rain is coming! The rain is coming!" The blessed clouds were moving with the glory of Allah. Rain was even falling over the pastures. One by one, they were falling on the soil. Everyone was jumping with joy. The soil and the fields that had cracked from the drought were once again fertile. Together with the people's joy, the fresh smell of the soil could also be smelled. The people of the pastures knew exactly why after months of waiting their last prayers were accepted. They were all saying, "This child is very blessed and brings much luck." Our prophet grew up quite differently from the other children. He started talking when he was 8 months old. He spoke fluently and properly. He stopped breastfeeding when he was 2 years old. During the time he remained at the pastures, there was no famine and drought. It was now time for the wet nurses to return the children to their parents. Halime was feeling very sad. She loved this blessed child as if he was her own. She always took care of him and loved him dearly. However, she had no other choice but to give him back to his mother. They took blessed Muhammad and went to Mecca. They handed him over to his mother. While Amina was happy, Halime was incredibly sad. One of them was feeling the joy of getting her child back, and the other was feeling the hurt and sadness of being parted from this child. At that moment, Halime made this offer. "Isn't it possible for me to keep the child for a little while? I'm afraid that he might get infected from the plague of Mecca." This was a very sincere offer. It was something that came from Halime's heart. Amina couldn't refuse this thoughtful request. She agreed to leave her child with Halime for a little while longer. Halime got what she wished for. Our prophet returned to the pastures with his wet nurse. All eyes were on him. Everyone was talking about his beauty, and their hearts were full of his love. The other children of his age were dying to become friends with him. Life in the pastures made our prophet experience the feeling of happiness. Our prophet had now grown up and was 4 years old. Halime was thinking of returning him to his mother, and her husband thought the same way too. Halime was very unhappy, but there was nothing she could do. This child was entrusted to her, so she could look after him only for a short time. The blessed child brought light to the Beni Saad tribe for 4 years. It was now time for his wet nurse to return him to his own mother. Halime and her husband went to Mecca that night. Then at one point our prophet was lost from sight. Halime and Haris became worried. They looked everywhere, couldn't find him. They found his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, and told him that he was lost. When the kind grandfather found out his grandchild was lost, he didn't know what to do and felt very sad. He started looking for him too, but it was of no use. He wasn't to be seen anywhere. Abdul Muttalib opened his hands and started praying. "My dear Allah, please return my Muhammad to me." Right at that moment, he saw 2 men. There was a child with them, and yes, this child was our prophet. The worried grandfather took his son of happiness that he was parted from and hugged and kissed him. He then put him on his shoulders, and together they went to Kaaba. He then gave him to his mother. Our prophet was now in the warm and kind arms of his mother, and he felt such happiness at that moment. His wet nurse, however, returned to the pastures, but she never forgot our prophet for the rest of her life. Our prophet always paid her respect to the person who looked after him for 4 years.